a PhD student at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Linda Rupert, who is an associate professor here in the history department at UNCG. And a quick introduction for Dr. Rupert. She earned her MA and PhD at Duke University, and some of her research interests include early modern Atlantic world and the Caribbean, and she has written and published several articles and book chapters, and has published the book entitled Creolization and Contraband, Curacao in the Early Modern Atlantic World. And to begin our interview, I wanted to start with the question, what initially drew you to study history?
Well, thank you, Emilee. I appreciate that. I have a more of a non-traditional career path. My background was actually in sociology, but I was actually living abroad in the Caribbean on the island of Curacao, and I became interested in learning more about the island's history, and it had always been studied as a Dutch trade center, and I was interested in reframing that history and bringing more to the forefront the role of people of African descent, but also the Sephardic Jewish merchants in creating Curacao as a trade center. So unlike many students, I came back to graduate school knowing exactly what I was going to write my dissertation about.
Is there any historian or historians that have influenced your work the most, or perhaps influenced what you wanted to study and focus on?
Oh my goodness, so many of them. Certainly the work of Peter Wood, who wrote the book Black Majority way back in the 1970s. That was based on his dissertation, just how he reframed the whole history of colonial South Carolina from a perspective of the colony having a black majority. The work more recently of the historian Lauren Benton, who looks at the intersection of legal history and geography, I find very, very compelling. But I would say the book that's influenced me, and to a large extent, is Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. He was a Haitian historian, and just the way he frames the idea that by definition historians engage in the process of silencing and that we need to own it and reflect on it in our own work has had a huge impact on me.
And how have you kind of incorporated the things that you've learned from those works into your own research and your own kind of study?
Oh, great question. Well, in the case of Peter Wood's work, I would say that the fact that if one recenters the history of a place, looking at the majority black population and how that influenced beyond just as labor, but influenced the very structure and way the society worked, has had a huge impact. In terms of Lauren Benton, looking at geography and then legal regimes in terms of thinking about how that impacted the Caribbean. And then, like I say, with Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's work, just thinking about much more consciously how am I myself engaging in silencing. We can't do it all. We can't write everything. So to be much more intentional and aware of the fact that my work by definition won't include everything, and thinking a lot more about what I'm including and why and what I'm leaving out.
And I know that kind of during your research and during your study, you've gone to many archives and done a lot of archival work. And what do you think has been one of the more interesting primary sources that you have happened upon in your work?
Oh, there are so many. I've been very fortunate, but I think back when I could go to the archives in Venezuela, and it's been 10 years since I've been able to go there, because with all the disruptions in Venezuela, not only was it not safe to go, but the archives were just in a terrible state of disrepair. But encountering these fragile archival documents that told the stories of runaway slaves from Curacao who had escaped to nearby Venezuela and made new lives for themselves, and how they appeared in the historical record. The case of one woman in particular, whose name right now escapes me, but she had a legal court case that went on for decades. In the mid 18th century, where she was trying to claim some land that she had inherited from her aunt, who had been a runaway slave from Curacao, and she herself had been born then in in Venezuela, but just to see her perseverance over many decades in repeatedly trying to get claim to that land that she had inherited was just such a powerful story, and how she was up against major landowners and oligarchs, and how she just kept at it and kept at it. It was an incredibly inspiring story.
And I think, would there be any advice that you would give kind of a PhD student or someone who's just starting out their research, finding like these archives? How would you suggest going about, starting this adventure of going to seek out these primary sources and following kind of maybe the trails of from archive to archive?
Yeah, all I can say is it's a very painstaking process, and I've been tremendously fortunate that I have the languages and I've had the funding to go to multiple archives. But you start by looking at footnotes in other people's works and seeing what archives they've gone to and what collections they've used that have been useful. And then you just have to sit in the archives for days, weeks, sometimes months. You have to go back repeatedly. Of course, that's not possible when you're writing a dissertation, but that's what I've been able to do after I finished my dissertation. And you just sit there and you go page by page through the material looking for something that's going to be valuable. I mean, I think everything I found has just been that, looking for a needle in the haystack. One summer when I spent 2 months in the Spanish archives, I got to be very close to some people who were there, also doing research there. And we started joking that I guess one person said, you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find a prince. Mm-hmm. And it got to be a joke among us. And at the end of the day, we'd look at each other and somebody would say frog. And then somebody would say prince. And so it was just like, did you find anything today or not? And it was like most days we did not find anything, but then we would find something.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of how you found a lot of inspiration from the primary sources from the archives in Venezuela. Were there any archives in particular that, you think, man, if I had the resources and I had the time, I would love to just sit in this archive for a month and just read?
I've been very fortunate that I've done research in well over 24 archives, probably closer to 30 archives at this point. So I've been incredibly fortunate that in 2 decades I've been able to go to so many. But the ones that really tear me apart are the Venezuelan colonial archives, because they simply got to the point where they didn't have good climate control. And so the documents were literally just falling apart in your fingers. So I got to the point with those where every time I went, I was going for a period between the early 2000s up until 2012 was the last time I was there. So it's been 10 years. But I went there numerous times, and it got to the point where every time I got an article, a document out, I would just take pictures of it and put it, and at the end of my visit, I would put them all on a CD-ROM and take it to the archive and say, look, nobody has to touch these documents again. Here are the documents that I have been able to digitize. I would love to go back to those archives, but I imagine there's not, a lot of the documents are permanently damaged.
And you kind of touched upon maybe a growing area that has been really beneficial for historians, which is digitization and digitizing primary sources. And do you have any resources that you turn to, any digitized archives perhaps that you would say, for any student who isn't able to travel, here is a place that I go to kind of look for things in my own research?
Oh, that's a great question, and I think increasingly over the past 20 years we've seen a lot of archives turn to digitization, and in the past 5 years even more so. I think the British National Archives in Kew have a lot that's digitized. Another set of archives that I work with, but you have to speak Dutch, is the Dutch National Archives in The Hague. They have a lot that's digitized. And probably the best example is all the different archives around Spain have a common portal called, the acronym is PARES, PARES, where you can get onto that portal and find material from all the different archives in Spain. That's a wonderful resource. Again, you have to speak Spanish, and they don't have everything digitized. So I doubt it will ever get to the point, except in very small archives, I doubt it will ever get to the point where everything is digitized. Closer to home, I would recommend the map collection at the John Carter Brown Library. They have an incredible number of maps from around the Americas digitized. So if you're looking for material that you could use for any study that has to do with North, South, Central America, or the Caribbean, you can pull up their maps, and they're a gold mine.
Yeah, that's really helpful to have kind of that guidance, and definitely those digitized sources is helpful, especially during times where you can't really leave home.
Yeah.
And I guess to kind of turn more to your own kind of interests and your publications, which would you say publications or maybe conference presentations of yours would you say you are most proud of?
Oh, goodness. Like all academics, I'm very aware of the limitations of everything I've written and how much better it could be. I think the book I wrote about Curacao, which was my dissertation, which is what got me coming back to school later in life, and then became my dissertation and then eventually a book. I'm proud of that just because, one, I think I put Curacao on the map in a way that had never been put before, and I'm amazed that I'm still getting royalties from that book. I'm still getting calls to do presentations based on that research, even though that research is 15 years old and more. And I'm just proud that I was able to kind of recast the history of Curacao in a different way and say yes, it was a Dutch trade center, but the people who were doing the trade were not the Dutch merchants who were sitting very comfortably in their counting houses and their merchant houses, but it was the people who were actually going out on the boats and sailing who were responsible for building that Dutch trade center. And I'm proud of that.
And I definitely hear when you describe that book and that research, what a passion you have for Curacao. And I would love to hear kind of more about what, even beyond the historical research and the historical narrative, what draws you to Curacao? Why do you have such a passion for this place and this people?
Well, quite simply, when I was in grad school the first time around getting a master's in sociology, I met and fell in love with a Curaçaoan anthropologist and moved to Curacao, and we raised our children there, and we had a very lovely life there. And it was in the process of living there and being very involved in local society. I learned the local Creole language, Papiamentu. My daughters are what we say in Papiamento, you Corsao, children of Curacao, and they're very proud of their heritage. And so I just felt a very, very deep commitment to the island and its people. But goodness, I left that island 22 years ago now. That's hard to believe, but it's still near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, that's amazing. I guess kind of moving towards some of your role as a teacher as well as a professor, or as well as a researcher. What are some courses that you teach here at UNCG, and which of those courses would you say are maybe the most fun to teach for you or the most fun to prepare?
Well, hands down, that would have to be my course, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Real Story, right? Which early on in my career, I tried to teach a course on the role of the early modern Caribbean in world history, which now I do teach that, but early on it was not very successful. And so I reframed it as, what can we learn about the political and economic history of the region by studying pirates? And that got to be great fun. And that course has evolved so much over the almost 15 years that I've been teaching it. And now it incorporates a lot more of material culture and non-document, other forms of evidence besides documents. There's a lot about popular memory and museum exhibits. It's just great fun. And one of the really great things about it is students come in with these stereotypes, and they learn that piracy is a lot different than they thought. One of the best remarks I ever got on a student evaluation was when a student wrote, pirates are much more complicated than I thought, but they're also way cooler. So I thought, I'm successful if that's what they think.
Yeah, you did your job.
I did my job.
And I know from personal experience that you are quite an effective teacher. And I would love to know if there are any tips that you would have for someone who is going into that profession. What makes an effective teacher?
Oh, wow. That's something a lot of us think about.
Question.
But I think the most important thing is it's not that different from what makes a good writer. Know your audience. Know your students. Take your students for where they're at, not where you would like them to be. What's the famous phrase? We teach the students you have, not the students you wish you had. And that can be more challenging, but it's so much more rewarding. And we've certainly seen it, in these past 5 semesters of the pandemic, to really take students where they're at and see how we can nudge them and push them a little bit, push them beyond what they think they're capable of, but realistically, and, tough love, but be there, be supportive, but also, kind of be a coach and say, you can do it, you can do it, let's push you beyond where you think you can be.
And I guess kind of moving beyond even we've spoken about your role as a researcher, your role as a teacher, and I was just curious if what some of your interests kind of outside of your historical studies are. Who is Dr. Rupert when she leaves the office and heads home?
There we go. Well, Linda Rupert is someone who enjoys hiking, who once upon a time enjoyed going to performances on a regular basis and is starting to do that very cautiously again. I love all sorts of theater and music performances. Human creativity just really sparks me a lot. I love to travel. I have over the past 2 years gotten to know a lot more of Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia because that was possible, but I hope to do some more international travel again. I miss that. And I love to sew, and I love to not just make patterns, but also design things. So sewing and hiking are my real passions and my real hobbies.
That's amazing. You touched on kind of musical theater, and I myself am also hoping for the day that we kind of get back to going there more often. But what would you say is one of your favorite theater kind of productions or musicals?
Oh, goodness, so many. One I just saw, it was the world premiere of an opera called Sanctuary Road. And it's a new one for me. And it's a one-act opera based entirely on the writings of a man whose name now escapes me, and that's embarrassing. But he was a nodal point on the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. I actually went a couple of weeks ago, very cautiously masked in the very back of the balcony. But I'm so glad I went because this opera is 100% based on the testimonies he took from people as they arrived from the South in Philadelphia and then were headed farther north. And he published a book, and every single word and every single lyric in that opera is from those testimonies. Wow. And it, of course, since it's related to, I study runaway slaves in the Caribbean, but it just gobsmacked me. And it was so inspiring. I'm also a great fan of Hamilton. Who wouldn't be,
Yes.
And I just recently saw the movie West Side Story, and I was bowled over at what Steven Spielberg has done with that. Wow. He's recast it as really about people from 2 different groups who are being messed over by the system and take it out on each other. And it's such a powerful social statement about how when the system isn't doing right by people, groups can turn against each other. And it was just very inspiring.
And as our interview comes to a close this afternoon, my final question for you is related again to academia, kind of bringing it back. Do you have any advice for someone who is just thinking about getting a PhD or entering academia? Any kind of final words of advice?
I would say go with your passion. As we know, the job market is not good. I myself didn't start my PhD till I was in my 40s. You really have to want to do this and love it and be committed. It's harder than you would think, but if you're really committed to it and it's the right thing, it will keep you going. But always follow your passion.
That's really great advice. Well, thank you so much for sitting with me today. I was so excited to get to learn more about you.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Thank you so much, Emilee. I appreciate it.